Thanks for coming back for the last hour today. Next, we have Keynote by somebody who basically doesn't really need an introduction in this community. In one way or another, I think we all work for him, trying to make this thing that he has outlined for many years in the world we want to have. And in some other ways, we also work exactly against him because some of what he's written in his novels on the dystopian side is the kind of thing we are trying to avoid. And so I think there's nobody really any better suited to address this community than Cory Doctorow. Cory, take it from here.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the guy who wrecks your feeds with threads most days. And I've been asked to speak to you about, I guess, the intersection of the Fediverse and distributed computation or rather distributed social media and my own work. So you probably know that I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been working on these issues for now 23 years. And in the last couple of years, I've managed to get a lot of normies to be more interested in tech policy by coining this word that lets them swear. And that word is enshittification. And it turns out that it's just a very minor license to profanity is a great way to get people to engage with what I flatter myself is a pretty nuanced, technical, political message about how we got here and what we should do about it. So I'm going to try and describe the intersection of my theory of enshittification and how it relates to the Fediverse for the next 28 minutes or so. And I hope that I can be coherent in doing this. So you'll probably know that enshittification starts as an observation about the characteristic pattern of tech platform decay, a three-stage process where first the platform is good to its end users, it finds a way to lock those end users in, and once they're locked in, it can abuse them without risking their departure. The more locked in they are, the more they can be abused, and not for sadistic reasons, although I think some of the people who run these platforms have demonstrated themselves to be sadists, but for material gain and not for the platform's immediate material gain. Then the next stage of enshittification is for the platforms to take some of the benefit that used to be enjoyed by users and hand it over to business customers. So that might be drivers or platform sellers, it might be performers, it might be publishers, it might be advertisers, because a platform mediates between business customers and end users. And it gets those platform users that are commercial locked in as well. And you've probably heard, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. I strenuously disagree with this, because what happens next in enshittification is that those people who are paying for the product, those people who are the platform sellers, the commercial users of it, get locked in. They get locked into us. We're locked in usually to each other if we're talking about social media, by the problems of coordinating a departure from a social media platform. And they get locked in by us. They become dependent on our custom, our attention, our money, our subscriptions. And then the platform can put the screws to them. And the end stage of enshittification is for all of the surplus value, all of the loose change to be extracted from the platform, leaving behind the kind of bare, kind of homeopathic residue needed to keep end users locked in and then business customers locked to end users, while that surplus is reaped by the firm's investors and by their by their executives rather. So that's the part of the theory that everyone has latched onto for, I think, a good reason. We've all observed it, right? We can recognize this account of what happened to a lot of different platforms that we used to use and that we still use, whether that was LiveJournal or MySpace, or whether it's Twitter or Amazon or Uber or Facebook or many other platforms that we're reliant on. But the most important part of the theory is not this procession of the disease, but rather it's epidemiology, not what's happening, but why it's happening, and in particular, why it's happening right now. And I have a friend and colleague who has a theory of this. His name is Ed Zitron. You might have read his work or heard him. He's got a great podcast called Better Offline. He's got a newsletter called Where's Your Ed At? And Ed talks about this thing he calls the rot economy. And he shows how some of the kind of characteristic lessons of MBA programs and the associated ethos causes executives of tech companies to engage in this really awful behavior, this behavior that harms users and business customers. And that, the purpose of the MBA is, depending on your point of view, either to locate people who have a kind of howling void where their moral center should be, or to take people and replace their moral center with a howling void. And I think that Ed's work is very important. And I think that it indicates that, for so long as there have been kind of suits and business people within tech companies, there have been people who had the enshittifying instinct, who would have enshittified things if they could have. But I think that what's missing in Ed's theory, and what is answered by enshittification, what makes them complementary theories, is that enshittification describes why it's happening now. The thing that changed to allow these people who are always within firms, and looking at the thumbnails of the people on this call, I think a good number of you probably worked in tech for a long time, and you will have known that there were moments where, sitting around a product planning table or some other kind of meeting, there were people there who had ideas that were very bad, and those people lost the argument. And that we can recognize that today we see them winning the argument. So what changed to let the worst people in the company set its direction? Why do tech platforms listen to them now? And my theory is that those people were empowered by what I call the collapse of discipline, the forces that used to punish firms that did bad things. The first and most obvious one is competition. All of the things being equal, firms that treat their end users and their business customers worse will lose those people to rivals, as they will also lose their best employees, who will walk out the door rather than sit and buy while the products that they worked very hard on are destroyed and the users that they care about are harmed. But of course, competition has dwindled, and it's dwindled for, policy reasons. We allowed companies to ignore antitrust law, to engage in predatory acquisitions, predatory pricing, other conduct that's just prohibited by the black letter of competition law. And competition law is surprisingly unified around the world. The US is arguably the birthplace of anti-monopoly law. The first anti-monopoly law in the US was 1890 Sherman Act. It was added to by several other laws in the years that followed. And after World War II, the technocrats who rebuilt the legal systems of Europe and England did so by effectively pasting in American antitrust law. This also happened in Korea and Japan as part of the Marshall Plan. And so you see a lot of countries around the world that have antitrust laws that look a lot like American antitrust laws, and yet they were ignored. And they were ignored everywhere, and that was because economists, the neoliberal economists, you have Hayek and von Mises, you have particularly Milton Friedman, and a guy called Robert Bork, who was a judge that Ronald Reagan tried to elevate to the Supreme Court, advanced theories of monopoly law that, on the one hand, argued that technically it was a bad idea to prevent monopolies, that monopolies were efficient and they should be encouraged because they would deliver lots of value to consumers. But also, they had this kind of QAnon conspiracy theory that if you read the anti-monopoly laws in the right way, you would find that they were actually pro-monopoly laws. And this despite the fact that there's just no way that this can be supported. It really is the kind of Gnostic word games that you see, people playing in QAnon forums, where it's like, oh, you have to like remove every second word and then read the Sherman Act backwards and you'll find its true meaning, right? It just makes no sense. But when we remove competition law, which is a process that has been underway for 40 years, we let companies buy their competitors. And we see over and over again that this is the growth strategy of tech firms, whether that's Facebook buying Instagram after Mark Zuckerberg realized that people preferred Instagram to Facebook and they were defecting by the millions, or whether it's Google, right? A company that I think bills itself as Willy Wonka's idea factory, but when you look closely at them, you find that they've done exactly one successful thing in-house, which is search, and every other major success they've had was something they bought from someone else. And virtually every internal initiative was a failure. So, Google videos stank and sank, YouTube succeeded. YouTube was something not founded at Google. And those acquisitions would have been illegal. So that's the end of competition. Competition doesn't discipline firms the way they used to. We live in what Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text for the other 4. And that's the web we use. Um, but there are other sources of discipline. So competition is the discipline of the market, but there's also the discipline of the government, the state discipline of regulation. And here again, when competition goes away, regulation follows, because competition and regulation are related to one another. They're interrelated phenomena. Firms that exist in a kind of cartel-like environment of 4 or 5 companies, or 3 or 2, or especially one, they find it very easy to agree on what their policy priorities are going to be. They become very, very incestuous. Think of Sheryl Sandberg hopping from Google to Facebook and setting policy at both firms. And they find it very easy to both tacitly and explicitly arrive at policy priorities. And because they don't compete head to head, because they divide up the market like the Pope dividing up the New World, they are able to uh, save a lot of money that they would otherwise lose by competing with each other. Peter Thiel says competition is for losers. Sometimes you hear people call it wasteful competition. And that waste, by doing away with it, by not competing head to head, leaves them with a lot of money to turn policy priorities into reality. And so in America, you have things like the fact that um, there hasn't been a new privacy law since 1988, a new consumer privacy law since 1988. Ronald Reagan banned video store clerks from telling newspapers which VHS cassettes you have. That's the last time America saw fit to update its consumer privacy rules. In the UK, we just saw the extraordinarily effective Competition and Markets Authority lose its leader at the hands of Keir Starmer, who fired the head of that agency and replaced him with the former head of Amazon UK. Right? This is the kind of regulatory capture that always follows from cartelization, and so the discipline of the market goes away, and the discipline of the state goes away with it. But you have also the discipline of labor. So labor, the tech workforce, is uniquely composed in that it is both very powerful but also almost entirely not unionized. And the power of the tech sector's labor market came from the fact that they were in high demand, and they're extraordinarily productive, right? You have tech firms that make, sort of $1 million per employee. And when you're making that kind of money from an employee, you can afford to pay an employee very well. But when that employee can walk out the door at any minute and get a good job with someone across the street, you have to keep that employee happy. And so the tech workforce enjoyed a lot of benefits, these whimsical campuses with, gourmet cafeterias and massages, and like a surgeon who will freeze your eggs so you can work through your fertile years. And tech workforces, enjoyed those benefits, but worked through the night and through their families' funerals and through Little League games so that they could ship products on time. And they resisted very thoroughly their boss's enshittificatory impulses. They cared about the user. I call them Tron pilled. They were fighting for the user. And as the supply caught up with the demand, which has definitely happened, we've had 500,000 tech layoffs in the last couple of years. You found that the tech workforce just lost that power. They had a moment where unionization could have been achieved relatively straightforwardly because they were in such high demand. But tech workers, by and large, saw themselves as temporarily embarrassed founders and not as workers. And they did not want to join or form a union. And so now it's in many ways not too late, but it's a much more difficult moment. And so tech workers aren't stopping their bosses from enshittifying either. And then the final source of enshittification, the one I really want to devote the rest of this talk to, is one of my favorites. It's interoperability. And interoperability, it's an anti-enshittifying force that is all but unique to tech, because these Turing-complete universal von Neumann machines that we build our products and services on are capable of running all the programs that are valid. And that means that for every enshittifying program, there's a disenshittifying program. For every ad, there's an ad blocker. For everything that stops you from putting third-party ink in your printer, there's a thing that makes your printer stop checking whether you've put third-party ink in it. For every bootloader that checks to see whether you're using the official operating system and therefore the official app store, there's a defeat that allows you to load your own OS, right? Or an OS that's patched in ways that disables those checks, right? And that is sort of latent in technology. And when you look through the history of technology, you see it over and over again. You know, IBM 360s are challenged by the so-called seven dwarves, these electronics and tech companies that made printers and drives and keyboards and screens and other peripherals that were what they called plug compatible, but today we might call adversarially interoperable, right? IBM didn't want these things plugged into their mainframes, but because they were universal Turing complete von Neumann machines, someone could always figure out how to plug them in. And if IBM wanted to make 1,000,000% margin on its hard drives, Fujitsu would sell you one with 100% margin. And that carried on through the ages, whether that was ad blockers or, you know, Apple making iWork Suite, where you could read and write all the Microsoft Office file formats, and you didn't have to throw away your Mac to converse with someone who was using a PC. You could just exchange files very freely, despite the fact that Microsoft's Office for the Mac was the most cursed piece of software they had ever shipped out of a crowded field, and just waving the Office for Mac installation disk around the office would cause files to spontaneously become corrupt. So, you know, that has been in technology's DNA for a very long time. And when you look at social media, you see interoperability as a main piece of the story. So, you know, when Mark Zuckerberg opened Facebook to people who didn't have a .edu address to the wider public, he had this problem, which is that everyone who wanted to use social media already had an account on a service called MySpace. And you know, there were all of the problems of leaving social media associated with MySpace. You know, the biggest one being the collective action problem of getting all your friends to decide to leave. And maybe you hated MySpace. Maybe you were really aggrieved that this evil, crapulent, senescent Australian billionaire Rupert Murdoch had bought MySpace and he was doing all this commercial surveillance stuff. Maybe you were excited by the fact that Mark Zuckerberg promised people who switch to Facebook, Facebook is like MySpace, except we will never spy on you. That was the original Facebook pitch, the non-surveilling social media network, right? But as much as you loved your friends and as much as you hated Rupert Murdoch, your friends were a giant pain in the ass and you couldn't get them to agree to anything. And so the fact that you were on Facebook didn't mean that they were going to come to Facebook. And there was a limit to how many times you could read that great privacy policy before you started to feel a little lonely. And so Mark Zuckerberg gave people a way out. He gave them a bot, and you gave that bot your login and your password, and it would go to MySpace several times a day, log in as you, scrape everything in your inbox on MySpace, put it into your inbox on Facebook, let you reply to it, and push it back out to MySpace, right? So what that did in economics terms is it took the collective action problem of deciding when you were all going to leave Facebook, or rather MySpace, rather, and decomposed it into a series of individual decisions with no collective action problem. Because whether or not your friends left MySpace, you could leave MySpace and still be in touch with your friends. And then it took the switching cost of leaving MySpace, which is everything you lose when you leave MySpace, which is to say the company of your friends. And it zeroed that out too, because the fact that you were on Facebook and they were on MySpace didn't matter because you could still talk to them. And what it did finally was it turned network effects on their head. So network effects, I'm sure you're familiar with, is this idea that there are some products and services that get better the more people use them. So, you know, the more people there are using Microsoft Office, the more people there are you can collaborate with. If you're using Microsoft Office, you can send your PowerPoint to them and they can send their PowerPoint to you, or Word doc or Excel files. And so these network effects grow and grow. And certainly we see network effects, especially in communications technologies. One fax machine is useless. 1,000,000 fax machines makes fax machines indispensable. One email client is useless. Once everyone's on email, then everyone has to be on email. And once there's 3 billion people trapped in meta platforms, it's very hard to be a Zucker vegan who refuses to use them because there's a lot of benefit that arises from it. But here's the thing about network effects is they're double-edged swords. If you are on MySpace because you value the company of some specific group of people, then as those people start to leave, the value of MySpace goes into steady decline and it becomes easier and easier for you to go. And so this was an amazing piece of jujitsu, giving people an easy tool to depart the platform. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that's why I'm so interested in ActivityPub and in particular in Mastodon, because of this built-in feature that lets people hop around from servers. If you can easily leave one server and go to another server, that acts as a check on bad mod behavior, right? If the problem of switching costs and its relationship to enshittification is that the more it costs you to leave a platform, the worse the platform owners can treat you, then the corollary of that is that the easier it is to leave a platform, the less it costs you to leave a platform, the better they have to treat you, or you will leave. And of course, sometimes they won't get the message. And in that case, you can just go. So it is not only a thing that encourages good behavior, it is a remedy for bad behavior. Now, one of the things I like about account migration and the way that it works in Mastodon as a policy question, and you know, if you understood anything about my little discourse about constraints, it's that the way that we got enshittification was not just that people had taken an MBA program and ended up working their way into companies. It was that we created the enshittigenic environment that let those people who'd had their brains poisoned by MBA programs win the argument by successfully arguing that they could do bad things without facing consequences. Well, if we are going to change the policy environment, if we're going to make an anti-enshittigenic environment, a disenshittifying environment in policy, account migration is a great policy. And it's a great policy, first of all, because it has this effect on people who administer services where they want to work better. And if they fail to work better, then they pay an immediate price. But also, and this is very important because it's highly administrable. There are lots of policies we can imagine and write down that are hard to enforce, even if they're well-intentioned, even if they're good policies on paper. So take a prohibition on hate speech as a matter of policy. This is something we've seen to a greater or lesser degree in Canadian, UK, and European law. And the problem, as we see in reality, and as I think we should have predicted in the run-up to the passage of these policies with an anti-hate speech law, is that it's very hard to administer, right? First, you have to agree on a common definition of hate speech. Then you have to agree on whether a specific act by a specific user meets that definition. Then you have to determine whether the platform took reasonable steps to prevent that hate speech act from taking place, which can be an extremely fact-intensive process, especially when you're talking about the very large platforms that are each of them sui generis, right? Facebook's infra does not look like the infra of any other service. And to a first approximation, everybody who understands Facebook's infra in an intimate, technical way is a Facebook employee. And so figuring out whether Facebook did the technical thing they needed to do to prevent the hate speech involves deposing a bunch of hate speech, a bunch of Facebook engineers. And then once you've done all that, right, agreed on a definition of hate speech, agreed whether something rose to the standard of hate speech, agreed that Facebook didn't take prudent action to prevent that hate speech, well, then you can punish Facebook, right? And that's 7 years later. And meanwhile, hate speech acts are taking place on Facebook's platform at the rate of hundreds per minute. And so as an administrable remedy, it's very poor. It's not well matched to the activity you want to administer with your policy. And as a result, it has not, and I think will not get us very far. And this is not a defense of hate speech. This is a realpolitik about defending the people who encounter hate speech with remedies that work instead of remedies that just make us feel good. You know, giving people another reason to be angry because not only did they experience harassment and hate speech, but that harassment and hate speech was also in the face of a policy that we've agreed on democratically without giving them an actual remedy and just the right to be more aggrieved does not help them. So what can we do that helps people who are at the brunt of hate speech, right, of harassment? Well, if we give people the power to leave, and go somewhere else where the moderators care more about their well-being, right? Then we resolve the obvious question about hate speech, which is why are people staying on platforms where they experience hate speech? right? Well, they're staying on there because the cost of absenting yourself from it is the loss of participation in civics or politics, in your social life, in communication with people that you may have left behind when you emigrated somewhere, access to community, access to employment or education or health information, and so on. These platforms are structurally important. And so, what we need to do is ease their departure. We've spent many, many years trying to get billionaires to be better unelected czars for life of the social media existence of billions of people. I think that's a disaster. I think it's failed, and I think it will fail. I don't think the problem with Facebook is that we have the wrong guy in Mark Zuckerberg's chair. I think we need to abolish Mark Zuckerberg's role. No one should be the unelected social media czar for life. And rather than getting firms to wield their power more responsibly, I think we should take away their power. And that starts by freeing the hostages they've locked to their platforms so they can go somewhere else. And so, while this is administrable in the sense that it is easier to determine than hate speech, it's also easier to catch cheating than hate speech, right? So if I'm on your server and I leave your server, or you kick me off of your server, and I say, well, where's the XML file that lets me go to another server so that I can pick up where I left off, and you insist that you gave it to me and I insist that you didn't, the only thing that the regulator has to do to resolve that dispute dispositively and forever is turn to the server owner and say, look, I know you're telling me that you gave Cory that file. I don't give a damn who's lying. Hand me the file and I'll pass it on to Cory. 10 people could administer a billion users in this portability remedy, in this portability policy. And if we impose a burden on people who create services to support this interoperability mandate, this mandate to allow people to hop from one server to another, we are saying to new market entrants, small startups, co-ops, groups of individuals, one individual wants to host a few friends. All we're saying to them is either run something that is stock Mastodon, or that takes the open source standards defined reference code and incorporates it into whatever else you're doing. And we're saying to large firms, yes, you're probably not going to be able to copy and paste the code out of GitHub for Mastodon's portability tool into Facebook's infra, but scaling that up is a much easier problem than inventing a portability mandate from the ground up. And moreover, we don't have to trust that Facebook, when they create that portability tool, does so in a way that is fair and doesn't parochially advantage Facebook, which is always a problem in standards making. So we already have an existing standard, and it's a thing that I feel very comfortable with. We could say even to people, if you host 10 people on your Mastodon instance, you just have a duty to hand the files over, and if you shut the Mastodon instance over, you have to escrow those files for 6 months, which is really all we're saying is you have to have like 500K of data on your hard drive for 6 months, right? This is a very, very easy to administer remedy that directly addresses the policy question that we're working with. Now, there are risks with the way that Mastodon Federation and Federation more broadly works. We saw those risks play out with email, specifically through the spam wars, where you had a legitimate, genuine problem of spammers and other bad actors too. Eventually, the spam wars grew to encompass certain kinds of coordinated harassment and also fraud and criminal activity, malware distribution, and so on. And the people who maintain the block lists of servers that were known bad necessarily started to say, well, I won't tell you who I am, because some of these services that I'm blocking, they're run by criminals, right? And the other ones are like just run by Nazis or whatever. I'm just not going to tell you who I am that's doing this. It's going to be a pseudonymous forum for deciding who can be in the Federation. And also, we're not going to have anything like a big due process kind of open court procedure when you get blocklisted on our block list, because like we're like a volunteer group of people who are trying to put out internet fires. We are not the Internet Supreme Court. And the last thing we want is for every person whose service is hosting spammers to just pester us endlessly with dice lawyering about whether we followed our own procedures. And so the outcome of that, which I think is quite predictable, is now we have an environment where it's extremely hard to host a mail server, unless you're a spammer, in which case you have all the money you need to figure out the ins and outs of DKIM and all those other aspects of running a mail server and being compliant, and in which nearly all mail has been funneled into like 3 or 4 giant mail hosts run by enormous corporations that are incredibly surveilling, and who have taken over those cartels, who decide who can connect and who can't. I don't know how we solve that with the Fediverse, but I think that anyone who looks at Fediverse Federation and says this can't happen here is failing to learn one of the most important lessons of Federation history on the internet. We don't want the Fediverse to be Outlook, Gmail, MailChimp, and 3 other services, except in Fediverse form, right? That's not a spam-free environment. That's an environment run by spammers and spooks and scammers and bad guys. It's the opposite of what we're trying to build. So one other policy question that, or policy initiative that might go some way to mitigating that is to migrate one of the core design features of the internet itself up to the service layer as a policy matter. So the foundational idea of the internet, right? The stuff that is embedded in the BBN and RAND Corporation work defining internetworking is something called the end-to-end principle. The idea that intermediaries in the network should only concern themselves with efficiently and reliably routing data between willing senders and willing receivers, and that they shouldn't be intervening in any way to overrule the choices of the sender and the receiver. That's not to say that you can't have a spam filter if you nominate the spam filter, but no one should be running a spam filter without your permission. And certainly what they shouldn't be doing is what we call in the context of ISPs and network neutrality, network discrimination, where the services that pay extra get priority delivery and the services that don't get seen. We have that at the network layer by and large, and it's pretty important to the way the internet works, but we don't really have it at the service layer. Google is under no obligation to show you the objectively best match for your query, and many queries don't have an objectively best match, but some of them do, right? When you search for Cory Doctorow, the objectively best match is my website, followed by probably my Wikipedia entry. But my website's pretty canonical, and it should at least be at the top of the list. Amazon, if you search for a product number, like a part number, it should be the first result, but actually Amazon makes $38 billion a year selling off search results. So the first result on an Amazon search on average is 29% more expensive than the best match for your search. And the top row is 25% more expensive than the best match for your search. And the best match for your search is on average 17 places down on the page, although not exactly 17 places. You can't just count down 17 and click that one and get the best bargain. None of the social media platforms will guarantee you delivery of the people you subscribe to, which is the same issue, right? If I ask the platform to show me everything published by so and so, then the end-to-end way, the neutral way of that platform operating is to show me everything published by so and so. And again, this is a policy that is highly administrable, because you can determine pretty readily whether or not that's happening, right? You just stand up some accounts, subscribe them to each other, and see whether when one posts, the other ones see it. And that tells you whether or not the policy is being obeyed. And again, it's one that doesn't set up a lot of gnarly compliance moats, because, if you're writing a search engine or you're writing a social media tool, guaranteed delivery and best match results are the way that you would write it as your first cut at the problem. Everything that makes like the second best match or something other than the thing I've asked to see show up, it's extra code, right? So all we're saying is, your code in a state of nature complies, and it's only when you start fucking with it that maybe you're out of compliance. So all of this is to say that ultimately the role of an intermediary is to disappear, to be the facilitator, to be the plumbing. And as we all know from our own plumbing, if you're noticing your plumbing, it's because something's horribly wrong. And so I am very agnostic. I'm wrapping up the talk here. Someone in the chat asked me how I feel about Blue Sky. This may disappoint some of you who are great Mastodon partisans, I'm indifferent to both Mastodon and Blue Sky. I would like both. I would like it to be totally as relevant to me whether I was using Mastodon or Blue Sky as whether I was using like Firefox or Brave, right? Like just not all that important. I am not on Mastodon because of the software design. I'm on Mastodon because of the people, right? And in the same way that like no one wanted to hang out on OG Facebook and read the privacy policy, I don't want to hang out on OG Mastodon and read the software license, right? I want to be on Mastodon because of the people who are there. And I care about the people. I am Tron pilled. I fight for the user. And I want those Blue Sky users who are trapped in a great party with no fire exits to get fire exits before the club burns down. And so I want them to have federation with us and with other Blue Sky servers. And like I'm mindful that the CTO of Blue Sky now says that he can run an instance, what we would call an instance of Blue Sky on a Raspberry Pi for 35 bucks a month. And my own sysadmin is currently sourcing a new box for the cage where all my stuff is hosted in Toronto. And as soon as that's there, I'm not only going to get my own Mastodon server, I'm going to get my own Blue Sky server too. And I'm going to be running my own instances of both. And I'm going to be multi-homing on both. And honestly, I am grateful to the people who build the plumbing and maintain the plumbing. I'm endlessly grateful to them, but I'm grateful to them because I don't have to notice what they're doing most of the time, because every time I flush, it just disappears. And that's all I want. So thank you very much.